Okay, so I'm going to be your exotic species today because I do not speak German yet. So I think it's very appropriate because I'm going to be talking about non-native species, and yes, I'll be that outlier today. And not only about non-native species, but also about urban forests. And if you're like me, so like I did ecology before, I worked with natural forests, and first time I would hear about urban forests, I'd like, what they are talking about? Like what? And so I hope to change a little bit your opinions about what is the urban forest and why we should care about urban forests, and actually what is the role of non-native species in the urban forest. So let's start with the city. So why do we care about the city? So we are living in an urban planet, and that means that most of the population is already living in cities, and by like in a few years, 2/3 of the entire population in the world will be living in cities. What does that mean? So cities is where we live. It's also a place full of opportunities. It's like a novel ecosystem, something that we didn't have before. It's also like a place where you can see, for instance, evolution happening in real time, something that even biologists didn't think it was possible. So there is a lot happening. And why people like me, ecologists, care about cities? There are so many amazing ecosystems and landscapes out there. Why cities? Well, for many people, and especially like the new generations, all the nature they know for a long time is the nature that they find in cities. So it's very important that we study it, we care about it, and we also start engaging people with nature. So that's what I do. I think it's very important, and then that's why I came to Freiburg. That's the place with a lot of green. So before I was in Canada, I started working with urban forests in Canada, and a lot of my examples will be from North America, so that's a bit my bias. But then I thought, okay, if I want to go back to Europe, where to go? There's Freiburg. And so just looking at this picture, what is an urban forest? So, like for those that study forestry, you know, have this very like concrete definition about an area that has to be covered by trees. But in a city, we are way more flexible. So there is these trees here, but then there is also these single trees here. And we urban ecologists, we think about everything as part of the urban forest. So we have different types, and also like the Europeans and North Americans, they used to look at that in a different way. So for instance, this would be an urban forest, like a forest in the middle of the city. Or like in Paris. Okay, this is a city, and then you have the forest just outside of the city. And that would be our forests. But you know what? North Americans have a very different view. So they would look at the city and think this is also urban forest. Everything together, and the focus would be on a single tree. So we should care and we should manage the urban forest tree by tree. And more, everyone came together with this concept that when we talk about urban forests, it's not just that woodland outside of the city, but is all the trees within the limits of a city. So that means a lot of diversity, because that means trees in private property. So a tree that you have in your backyard. That also means the trees on the street, so isolated trees. That means trees in the park. That means, for instance, these pocket parks that just pop up everywhere. So all of these together make up this urban ecosystem and the urban forest. And why do we care about urban forests? Well, we are in a city. Cities where people live, so we care about urban forests because we care about us. So when we look at trees, we also look about what are the benefits that we can get from trees. And it can go air quality, or in summer, the shade, so it's not so hot, or then just for social connection, for recreation, for doing exercise. But today I'm going to talk about urban biodiversity, and again, then the native and non-native species. So cities are actually an hotspot for diversity. For instance, these falcons here, this is from London. A few years ago, they were almost extinct in Great Britain. But now that they migrate to the city, they're like the kings of the skies. So the population just skyrocketed. So cities is not such a bad place. It's actually also a place of opportunities for many species. And everything is fine. I'm painting you a very pretty picture. But when you look like worldwide, we can see some patterns. For instance, different cities, like across the entire North America, the entire United States. How they look alike? Very much so. So all this diversity, all these opportunities, and in the end, we take a picture and they all look the same. And when we compare about the natural ecosystem surrounding the cities with what we find within the cities, that's amazing. It's an homogenization. It's completely different. So the question is, how diverse are our urban forests and our urban trees? Can you guess where I took this picture? Well, I didn't take it myself, but where is this from? Yeah. And does these trees look very diverse? No, it's all the same. And actually, this is the horse chestnut tree, and it's also a very nice story. Like, it was not from here. So this tree comes from Macedonia. It has a very small area. But these days it's everywhere, and it's everywhere in Germany. And do you know why we start planting these trees? This species is associated with beer gardens because it has this perfect shadow. So it can cover a large area, and it doesn't have deep roots. So they could plant it there. The roots would not damage the caves where they were fermenting the beer, and then people could just sit outside, enjoy the shadow, and enjoy their beer. So we can use these no-native species. And it's not just horse chestnut trees, huh? It's everywhere in Freiburg. If you pay attention, you'll see that trees look alike. So why so much debate about native versus no-native species? Well, first of all, when we talk about no-native species, we talk about invasive species, which is not the same thing, but sometimes they go hand in hand. So this one, it's also very common in Freiburg. Anyone knows which trees is that? Shouldn't be that difficult. What? Yeah, so a maple. This picture is actually from Montreal. So if you know the flag of Canada, it has a maple leaf. By the way, that leaf doesn't exist. Huh? The person that designed it, there is no maple that looks like that, but it's the tree of Canada. But this is a Norway maple. And the Norway maple is not native from Canada. There is a huge discussion because the most common species in cities like Montreal is the Norway maple. And when the Norway maple goes to the natural forests, then it becomes invasive. So there is indeed this trade-off between the cities, and people want it because the beautiful colors. And also here in Germany, like the honey locust, that is a problem when it goes to the natural forests. But in cities, oops, too fast. In cities, not so much. And also in cities, most of the time, we plant the trees. So we can actually, for instance, with the honey locust, we can control the distance at which we plant the trees. So we can minimize the risk. The second argument is that we say that native species, they are more adapted to the environment, so they will perform better. But are they really that superior? Well, it depends. If you talk, for instance, about habitats for birds or insects, when the species, they evolve together, then it's normal that the native birds and insects and small mammals will still prefer the native species. But if you look at the second argument, that the native species are better adapted to the conditions here, remember that I start by telling that cities are novel ecosystems. So it's not exactly what they were used to before. And it's quite difficult to grow in cities. So it's not every single tree that can actually grow in a city. And then there will be climate change. So there is this study that compared the climate of different cities now and in the future. And their conclusion was that, for instance, London will become Barcelona, sorry. So if London will become the new Barcelona, it should mean that the Hyde Park in London, in future, will look like this, the Park Güell in Barcelona. So we're gonna go to London and sit under a palm tree, because that's the climate. Is this good or bad? What should we do? Well, the question is, can we afford not having no native species in cities? For instance, this is the oldest tree in Paris. Guess what? It's not a native species. It's a honey locust. But it's there for a long, long time, and people are actually proud that they live nearby the oldest tree in Paris, and they do not care that much if it's a native or no-native species. And you know what? In some places, native tree species cannot give us everything we need from the trees. So when we think about planning how the city and the green spaces, we have to think about a lot of things, like the picture of the tree growing city. It's very difficult. There is no place for the roots. There is no place for the crown. There is problems with the power lines. There is people living in the city. And people's preference for trees, they change. We are all different. We all have different preference. So sometimes we only care about the color of the flowers, or the color of the leaves, or how tall it will grow. So we need to take into account that, and sometimes it's the pool of species that we have, it's not enough to satisfy everyone. So what would be the solution? Especially for cities, ideal would be to combine both. So this is already in London, where in the park they already have like pretty much every city in the world, native and non-native species. And then people can choose where to sit in the park. Do I prefer the shadow, or do I prefer the pretty trees so I can take a picture for the Instagram? That's a place for everyone. And there is even like recommendations that support us. So this guideline, the German guideline for which trees to plant in the street, which is one of the hardest places where to plant a tree because there is no space, and there is just paved surface, and there is people walking, and there is cars nearby. And when they recommend which trees to plant, guess what? They recommend more non-native species than native species. Because a few species that we grow everywhere in the world, like the ginkgo tree, it's only from China, a very small area, but we plant it in every city in the world. Why? Because it doesn't care about pollution, it doesn't care about heat, it doesn't care about lack of space, it just grows. It grows everywhere. So it's a perfect solution. So when it comes to make decisions, so there's a lot of things that we can do. So we have to think about if the species is adapted or not. And if London is becoming the new Barcelona, then we can look at Barcelona and look what species are growing well there. It's also like the importance of diversity. So which species are growing this area? Okay, there is this species A and B, so we're gonna go for species C and D. And maybe that's more important than just being native or no-native. Also, what type of ecosystem service we want. And the service is something like pollen, for instance, something that we should also account for. And this is also important. And of course, there is the risk of becoming invasive that we should not just ignore, but it's just a small part of the whole story. So my conclusion and my message today, the positive message that exotic species, a bit like me, we need them to achieve a high diversity in cities. And that's actually the most important message. Voilà.
the picture you showed in the beginning, the main picture for your talk, you showed it also again in the later slides. Could you tell a little bit about what those giant structures behind the palm trees are?
Yeah, those are not natural. There's no native and no native. They are just artificial trees. It's in Singapore. So, but the thing is, I don't have the picture here, but they just create this big garden where you do have a lot of nature. So they also plant trees, but those are a very particular kind of no-native species. So yeah, these are the palms, these are the real trees, these are just structures that they built to create, they call it super trees. That's the entire park. And there is a lot of diversity in there. So we can be creative, that's the place for cities. We can really combine different things. Yeah. I see two. Maybe I can hear.
Okay. I was just wondering, how do you actually identify species that would be invasive? Because I would say this is a very important point. That would not put it at the very end of the list. So how do you identify?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So how we determine if they are invasive or not? So usually the problem is not in the city itself, because like I said, most of the times in the city we plant a tree, so we kind of decide where we want tree A or tree B. So sometimes we learn from, for instance, from other cities. We know that, for instance, in city A, B, or C, we plant not only trees, but for instance small plants, and then we know that they went to the nearby green spaces and from there to the big forests. So there is that, so that we can learn from other cases. Other times from already like the behavior in their native ecosystem, but not so much. The problem is never that much the city. The thing is, most of the non-native species, and that works for animals, for plants, they come in through the cities. That's why we have botanical gardens. That's where we have the ports, the airports. That's where we move around. So we are always spreading them around. But becoming invasive in the cities for trees, that's barely the case.
Thanks for this super interesting presentation. Rita, did we already, or you already find the super tree for the city? Which one is the most preferred non-native tree in the urban area, for instance, here in Germany or even beyond?
So that's a problem with that question, because especially like people like me, we say we don't need a super tree, because most of the problem with urban forests, it's because we've been going for a super tree. So it started in North America with the elm trees. So people start planting elm trees everywhere because they were the super tree. They grow super fast. They have this perfect crown. They give shadow. They don't have such a deep root, so they don't damage too much. They grow fast, so people can plant it today, and when their children grow up, there is already a large tree. And it was all amazing. It worked perfectly until it came the elm disease. And then we lost all the elms in North America. What did you do next? We find the next super tree. So we plant ashes everywhere. What happened a few years later? The emerald ash borer. For instance, in Montreal, where we're working, we are losing 80% of all the ash in the city. What did we do next? The Norway maple. So yes, there are a few like superheroes when we talk about trees, like the ginkgo that grows everywhere. The ash was the same thing, and now we can even we already have elms and ash trees that can resist to the disease. But I'm all in favor of diversity. So I would say not go for a super tree, but go for many trees. So if something happens, we have some kind of we can manage it. There is enough diversity to find a solution. Sorry. Yep.
I have a question, because the insects and typical birds they are local. So how is that? Because they don't know these kind of trees. They have different flowers. What is happening?
Yeah. So So, of course, like, depending where we go in the planet, we find studies that actually found that some insects discover a new tree and then they actually prefer that tree. But one of the arguments in favor of preferring native tree species is for birds and for insects, because they evolve together. So it's normal that they prefer that. And also, like, sometimes when you bring a new tree species, you bring with that species some insects, and then they can become the problem. So in general, if we are talking about specific species, that could be the case, and normally there are more studies reporting that species prefer native species. But the non-native species, sometimes what they create is different habitats. And when you have this diversity habitat, sometimes you have species that will prefer that. So it depends a little bit, for instance, whether you have all trees that look like the same, and if it's a no-native species and you only plant that, then probably the birds won't be that much attracted to it. But if you somehow create more diversity, then you create more opportunities for the different birds and insects.